Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome to City Forum, and today's really important and interesting topic, the queering of planning and design. And, sometimes it's kind of easy in this particular atmosphere to get down about things, but I think when we look at the domain of sexual preference and sexual identity, the arc of history over the last 10 or 20 years has definitely been moving toward progress and justice. Fragile, always, but I think that's one area where things have substantially gotten better. A planning scholar, Michael Frisch, wrote an article in 2012 called Planning as a Heterosexist Project. And in that work, he basically laid out sort of a fascinating analysis of the planning field and its history, arguing that planners have sometimes thoughtfully and oftentimes thoughtlessly been complicit in making queer people invisible and or complicit in their suppression of these preferences and identities. So today we're going to hear from three terrific panelists about this issue, about their position in planning, how they see planning and design. And I'm not going to do long introductions because I think you guys are going to sort of talk about. But we are really fortunate to have Danielle Skidmore, and she is a transportation infrastructure engineer, has worked a lot on big planning projects. She also ran a really great and very competitive race for the city council. And then we have our illustrious alumni, Katie Coyne. Katie works at Asakura Robinson in their urban ecology studio. She was just telling me all the amazing work they did. We also have alumni, Cesar, who really helped put this together. Aves is also an alumni, but he re-upped and is now in our PhD program. So let me turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here. I think this is going to be an exciting conversation. We're really hoping, we're going to set the stage, have a conversation. Really, towards the end, we're going to invite you all to ask questions or honestly just join in the conversation. And I think the exciting thing was, I think when Dr. Wood and Rachel reached out to me, we're trying to think of this. I think it's interesting. That's not something that I'm always consciously thinking of in my work as well. So I think it was like a nice moment for us to reflect. We got on a call, and we were all kind of reflecting and finding it exciting to talk about it. So we're hoping to share some of that with you. So I think just to set the stage, what we're going to do is, rather than, as Dr. Wood said, doing formal introductions, we're going to ask everyone to speak a little bit about themselves and their work, so you can situate where we're coming from in terms of our practice. And as we talk about how our identities intersect with the practice, we can really talk about that in a meaningful way. So, Danielle, it's fine if we start with you.
Happy to do so. So, good afternoon, y'all. I'm so happy and excited to be here. And my name's Danielle Skidmore, and I'm a civil engineer, so my area of practice, I feel a little bit outnumbered here among planners, but I'm a civil engineer graduate of the University of Wisconsin. Throughout my career, I was always, I was never quite normal in my engineering practice, so I have good friends who were planners and would always joke that I just needed to come out as a planner one day. And a few years ago, I came out sort of in a different context as part of the LGBTQ plus community. But I practiced throughout Texas designing mostly transportation infrastructure, so more roads than I would like, but a lot of water quality and drainage associated with that. And those projects, when we look at like our transportation system, that built environment is so dramatically informs how our cities grow, and that's something that I'm looking forward to talking about. And certainly about what it's like being a transgender transportation engineer in Texas. It's always fun.
My name is Katie Coyne. I'm an alumni of the CRP program, but also sustainable design. I have a background in ecology. And so I really found my way to kind of the more rigorous ecological science side in undergrad, and really confused my advisors when I wanted to take ecofeminism and women's studies courses and sociology courses, and it drove me crazy as like a 20-year-old who couldn't quite articulate yet why all of those things are connected, and I needed both. And so when I found my way to planning, that was really an important step for me in figuring out that planners, if we do one thing, at least for me, we think about systems in a way that is very intersectional at multiple scales. And being able to think about social and ecological and economic systems and others, and how they all intersect in our communities all the way up to our regions, is what brought me to that. And I think it is a very similar concept to be able to think about intersectionality of individuals, and to be able to think about how all those systems are interacting in our communities, to think about vulnerability of individuals and communities. And so I work at Asakura Robinson now. I lead our urban ecology studio. I tell everyone what that is a science-based practice that tries to enhance the scientific rigor of our design and planning practice areas, which are landscape architecture, urban design, and urban planning. I'm based here in Austin, but we have offices in Houston, New Orleans, and Minneapolis. And I'm really passionate about that work because of my opportunity to work across many different contexts. So I'm working on everything from a site scale, so I'm managing a lot of sustainability and climate resilience conversations for the Austin FC soccer stadium. I'm also working on healthy parks plans that are looking at how to best leverage parkland in a 3-county area toward community health goals and community health disparities. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Katie. So I think as has been mentioned, I'm a graduate of the master's program here with the public affairs program. And now I'm a PhD student. But essentially my focus has largely been looking at affordable housing, both in terms of the work that I did when I was working here in Austin, Housing Works Austin, which is a local nonprofit looking at housing advocacy, and then also in terms of my research, and I still continue a lot of that advocacy work, so that's particularly where I'm coming from. And of course, racial justice, equity, social justice, poverty alleviation, those are all things that intersect with our work in a deep way. So that's all things that I'm thinking about. And I think one thing I wanted to mention was, as you can see, we all sort of have like a really range of experiences and things and fields that intersect with planning and design. And I think folks who have more for design perspective, folks who have more for like a policy and advocacy perspective, and we're trying to bring all of that experience and I think talk about how our LGBTQ plus identities intersect with that, and how does that inform our work. And it's interesting, once you start talking, there's a lot of similarities, and there's of course unique ways in which we're bringing that forward. So I think I'm just gonna open up to our panelists here and talk about just how do our identities intersect with our work. We've talked a little bit about work and it's all different, but how do our identities intersect with that?
I'll take it first. So, I think that I've never had a point of reference in our existing social structures for what I'm supposed to look like within them. And so that means that I was never taught to maintain the structures we have. And so I think I am much more likely to be able to innovate new structures for our communities and new structures for our cities, for our parks, for our regions, and because I am not interested in only staying with what the status quo is. Does that make sense? And so I think also because of that, I'm also, I think, innately more empathetic to others' experiences. And I can only speak to my experience. I identify as a lesbian woman. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I think my identity is also different than the way I am perceived, which is also an important differentiation. So I'm often perceived as a dude, and it's very embarrassing for people. It is not embarrassing for me. But I also identify as butch, and I know that I actually, and this might be unique to my experience as a white butch lesbian woman, but I know that when I go into a room of Texas good old boys, most of the time, I get to be somewhere higher up on the ladder. I can speak more confidently because of my identity and the way I'm perceived without being called a bitch, to be honest. And I know that I can see other people getting steamrolled. And so there's also a bit of my practice and my identity that manifests in these interactions, in these meetings that I'm constantly having with folks, that I'm much more, I think, attuned to than someone who isn't somewhere in between the boxes, if that makes sense.
And I just want to point out, like, it was interesting when we were having this conversation. I think one of the things we talked about was how essentially, you know, in terms of how we think about the world, the current structures have never served us anyways. You know, we've just never felt like we belong. They didn't serve us. Current institutions don't serve us fully either. Neither do they serve our community. And I think that allows us to, in some ways, as an outsider of regular institutions, but still working within them, to reimagine them based on how we would want them to function. And I think in some ways that allows us to answer sort of tricky questions around these fields and planning and issues and all the things that we're working on, not only in terms of, you know, how they impact us or our community, but also other communities that we would consider vulnerable or underserved. And how does that all work together? So it's interesting we had that conversation, and I thought it was nice to reflect on.
I love your commentary about how interacting in meetings, you know, in an environment that is still, you know, probably male dominated, right? Certainly in engineering it is. And, you know, my own personal sort of life experience is different in that I, you know, masqueraded as a straight white man for a long time. And, you know, while I was dealing with my own identity in a very private space. And, you know, and then part of transition, especially late in life, once I, you know, built a career and had a large network of colleagues and clients, was that everybody got to come along for the ride, and watching this person they knew start to evolve into somebody who they still know but is different. So everything you describe about, you know, the patriarchy is real, y'all, was part of my, you know, transition experience. And, you know, I would go into meetings and so, you know, I mean, I identify as sort of an out and proud transgender woman, sort of she, her pronouns, but I'd sit in these meetings and I was never talked over before in quite the same way. And especially if I was in a group of people that didn't know me for a long time. So it was always the most interesting test, because I remember sitting in a meeting with one of my colleagues with the thing, and she was a recent graduate, and I've been watching people just talking over me, and she was aghast. She was just like, oh my God, because she had never seen that happen before in a meeting with me. And you know, that was both the most affirming and disgusting experience all at the same time. But what it showed me, and I'll kind of close with this, is that, like, when we're interacting with each other professionally and in life and all, we're all like, we all do it instinctively. We're all categorized in some way. We're all put into some boxes. I keep wanting us to make bigger boxes. Eventually there'll be one big box that just says we're human. But and it does affect all of our interactions. And it is, I was not so aware of it before. You know, I'd like to believe I wasn't the person talking over others, but you know, there's no substitute for your lived experience.
I would also say, I think eventually that box goal is great, the human box. But I also think, you know, there is a role to be played with, you know, identifying in a way that brings power to an identity that was marginalized in the past. And so I think, you know, the easiest way to explain that is me using the word dyke as a source of power for me internally, and how important those words are that have been used in the past negatively, sometimes to reclaim power. But I also think me identifying out in public is a way of reclaiming power in the community. So I actually think we're going to go in the direction of the identity politics until the power dynamics shift in a very different way.
And it's funny you're raising that. I feel like I didn't mention, but like I always identify as queer and femme. And I don't even think of those terms as like, oh, these are historically not the terms that were used for folks or were not considered. It's just so normalized for me, for my own self to, I think, identify it that way. But you're right, like there's power in what language we're using and how we're expressing and how we're allowing people to identify and express those identities. And I think partially based on what you were both talking about. I think it's interesting, I always laugh about this. I think some people might have heard me talk about this in the room, but I'm often perceived as a woman on the phone. And people treat me like I'm an idiot because I somehow am perceived as a woman. It's like, ma'am, there's a button on the back of your router. Can you see it? I'm like, honey, I'm not blind. Even if you think I'm a woman, I'm not blind. You know, it's just bizarre how the way people just interact changes so radically, and we don't realize that. And I think it goes beyond, I think, just gender and gender expression, but also goes into sexuality and how people are perceived or not. I feel like you want to add something. You're like,
Oh, I'm just laughing about, like, you know, voices. We do it. We gender people by their voice all the time. So I'm misgendered from my voice most of the time. Drive-through is always the most fun. I mean, seriously, you know. Especially if I've like taken the trouble to like clean up and like it look cute. People around are like, sorry.
I know, and I think you're right, and that was going to be one of my questions, like what has our experience individually, personally been in the field? And it's true, I feel like people perceive you a certain way, and I've had like people talk to me on the phone and send me like Miss Azhar emails, and then they meet me like months later and they're like horrified or stumbling, and I'm just like, just pretend like nothing happened. Let's switch and keep going, because now you're making me awkward by being so awkward. But yeah, we wanted to talk a little bit about like that personal experience within those fields and your careers. We'd love to hear more about that.
I mean, I think I can build on my Texas Good Old Boy comment. I mean, I work in a field where we're interacting with civil engineers, all different kinds of engineers who probably went to A&M, that other school that we don't like, and you know, throw on a Columbia shirt, talk about camping and fishing, and like butch up my interactions, and all of a sudden I'm like somehow fitting into this, you know, oh, we can be kind of, you know, fun in our conversation together and have this kind of banter, and it's really interesting. So that's one experience, especially when I'm doing work outside of our cities, on the coast. You know, it's always, but I also think there's an interesting interaction for me mentally, because there's always a risk involved in doing that, because some guys like that generally, and I'm doing a lot of generalizations right now, some of those interactions are like, oh great, I get to be in that box, and now we're going to have this a little bit different relationship, and I get to use some of this, what I call butch privilege, in my favor. Other times they're just not having it. They're like, who is this liberal lesbian coming down from Austin telling me what you know, it is a gamble anytime I go all in on that. But I would also say, you know, I think I see women generally get steamrolled, femme women, in meetings, and I think even recently in practice, this is another example. I'm working with, like, this woman should be a role model for everyone. She's amazing. She is confident. She's an engineer. She's out of Houston. She's African American. She is so confident and is so smart and has amazing, innovative ideas around what green infrastructure should look like. And the white guy who is the project manager on the other firm's prime team, I'm using a lot of like, anyway, just is constantly triggered by her confidence. Constantly moves into like an anger kind of space instead of just like a, you know, reacting normally to someone. Like, they are getting angry every time this person is on the phone or in a meeting and saying like, I think we should do it this way, or let me be clear about this, and just speaking like any other normal, confident person would be speaking on the phone. And honestly, I'll be honest with you, I'm struggling with how to be an ally in that professional situation, because I know that would sometimes happen to me. I know that I also have more privilege in some ways because that sometimes doesn't happen to me. And I'm very opinionated and confident, and I will tell you exactly what I think on a phone call with a client or with our prime or whoever it is. I'm doing the exact same thing that this woman is doing. And I don't know the answer for how to deal with that professional conflict. You know, I don't know if it's reaching out to that person and saying, how can I be a better ally to you? What's going on? Like, help me, you know, support you. I don't know if it's confronting the prime. I don't know if it's letting it play out. It's difficult because in practice you're not just an activist who that's your job to be an ally or to act on injustice. You know, your job is on the line, your reputation is on the line, you know, you have to weigh like your livelihood and your own personal and familial security with, you know, how often do you step out? And that's a hard place to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, this, when we first started talking about this question, and, you know, as this engineer, I'll go really heavy on my engineer brain and say, you know, if I'm designing stormwater infrastructure for a street or a bicycle lane or something, you know, how does it matter that I'm trans? You know, like where in the plan set doesn't matter? And you know, and lots of my colleagues, especially as they struggled with my coming out, they would, you know, basically they drew comfort in saying, well, it just doesn't matter, you're still a good engineer. And like I met them where they were, right? So I like took that and saw that as their affirmation. But you know, what I've come to realize over the years is that I'm out and visible, and that they're processing that I'm still a good engineer, and I'm a woman now, and like that, you know, that visibility alone is hugely powerful for getting people to think about things, not just ourselves within the LGBTQIA community, but the people that are around us to think about things differently. And it is a challenge for each of us. And if you find yourself sort of identifying, in our community, like what is your responsibility to be an ambassador or a role model? And I would say the first responsibility is to take care of yourself, and do your job well, and then find the space where you are most comfortable. But what you're touching on speaks to this challenge that kind of becomes part of our everyday career interactions. It's a challenge, but it's also a gift too. I think engineering is way more fun for me now than it was before. Most things in life are, actually.
And I think what you're both talking about, and I think it's really interesting. I agree. It's part of like your daily experience in the field and academia everywhere. There's like this navigating, like what you were talking about, like you choosing how to express yourself, choosing how to present yourself, and you're constantly navigating. And that can be like, sometimes it can be a gift and enjoyable. You get to find your spaces and be yourself. And sometimes it's really challenging because it's tiring every day thinking, okay, well, where am I? How do I need to act here? And making that assessment to make sure that you're feeling safe or comfortable, or you're not challenging other people too much in a professional environment where that's not something that you're supposed to bring out. And I know that this is an experience I think a lot of folks have, right? Like this is something cis hetero women feel. This is something people of color face. This is something a lot of people are navigating, folks with disabilities, age. But I think that navigation piece becomes, it's something I would love to talk a little bit about, really, because I sometimes find it very exhausting.
I almost want to just, before we go into that,
Go ahead.
there's a lot of positive that I will say. I've been at my firm almost 4 years, and there's a reason I've been there that long. As like a right out of school intern, they're like, let's have the entire firm join the Austin, LGBT Chamber of Commerce. Yes, we support you taking time to do all this stuff as a board member of Equality Texas. Yeah, go up to the Capitol and sign up for that bill. They're incredibly flexible and supportive of who I am and what that means in terms of how flexible I need my job to be. You know, even just recently, like talking about like, we've been talking about how we have more inclusive renderings as a practice. And so there was just an article that came out about stock photos and how stock photo libraries were starting to try to see more, you know, diversity, including, you know, non-binary folks in stock photo libraries. I mean, we're talking more and more about how we include, you know, same-sex couples and non-binary folks like in our renderings. That even just that little visibility is incredibly important. So, and that's something that they're like, yeah, absolutely. We're already trying to make sure that we're thinking about all these other categories of diversity, and we should absolutely be thinking about that. And it was not, there's no uphill battle, there's no, if anything, it's just I reminded them and they're like, oh yeah, we're totally on board, we're doing it. So that has been a really nice thing, and I think has been key to my success and my ability to be more confident in all the rooms that I'm in as part of my job, because I know that they have my back.
You guys want to add anything to the navigating question?
Well, I think that I think more and more often your story is a story in a professional environment. It's not the case in all employment environments. So I remember, you know, remind myself that a lot of the privilege that I gave up a bunch of privilege, you know, white male privilege, but I keep a lot. I still live in Austin. I'm still professional, and you know, there are a lot of folks that are in our community that don't have the same sort of affirming work environment, and that sort of, I guess, sort of reminds me, or it does give me a sense of responsibility to keep the visibility and make sure that I don't sort of, you know, because that's moving a conversation that eventually will trickle down not to the engineering company but to the construction company. You know, like if I go out into a construction site, my experience is different, you know, and now over the years it's like I have to decide whether anybody even needs to know I'm trans or not. And you know, I've taken to, I always wear my trans pride flag because I don't really want the passing privilege, to be honest with you. And that's complicated in its own right, because I say that knowing that I can if I need to. But how to navigate that sort of space is, for me, it's like grace and compassion for myself and for the people around me, and humor is really powerful. So, like, if I know that people are, you know, uncomfortable with me, I just kind of own it right away. It's like, you know, this is gonna be beautifully awkward, but you're gonna be fine, you know. And when you give people that little bit of space, then all of a sudden they start to take down all the barriers that they've built around themselves, and that's, to me, that's like this beautiful, powerful experience. So I have to share a little story from Monday. I was at the Capitol testifying against some of the awful legislation that comes up every 2 years, and it was on the floor of the Senate, and it was the Senate committee, State Affairs Committee, and they read your names from a card, and so we all turn in our cards, and they call your name up to go join the table, and the chair of the committee, you know, read the card, and he said, Daniel Skidmore, and he just misread Daniel, and then, of course, then I walked up there, and like, he was horrified. I mean, he was terrified. This is somebody, one of the, you know, kind of on the side of supporting this sort of kind of hurtful legislation. And afterwards, he came up to me, and he was like trembling. He goes, I didn't know. And I was like, dude, we're good. I get it. You just misread my name. But there are a lot of people that I feel like they're walking on eggshells when to the extent that people can realize that they don't really need to. You just need to have some respect and kindness. That really opens up a lot of doors.
Yeah, I think it's a bunch of things, you know, they're hitting me. I really think that where you land, where you work, what field you're in, that really shapes, you know, how much you're able to explore and be yourself. And I think it's sometimes good to really be like, okay, we have a bunch of privilege here as we're talking about this. you know, I'm somebody who might end up situating myself in academia, and there's a lot of privilege that comes from that. Like, academia is generally considered to be really comfortable, but it's really funny. I'm going to tell the story because the first time I heard it, I loved it, which was, so one of the professors here, who's one of the really big champions of LGBTQ, I think, advocacy and rights on campus, she joined the university around like 88, I want to say, so like late 80s, maybe early 90s. And I think she moved from the East Coast, and she never bothered asking whether her wife could get benefits or not. She just assumed my wife is gonna get benefits. Those benefits did not come until like 20 years after that, where she had to like struggle with that. But even within those spaces, there's so much that's not offered to folks, I think, in their professions, in their fields. And I think that's sometimes important to remember.
I would say two things about navigating. Even before you take a job, it's really easy to go look at all the photos of the people who work at a place that's given you an offer. And if you're scrolling and scrolling for days and it's all white dudes, it's probably not going to be as affirming of a place. And I hate to make that generalization, but it's true. And that makes it really difficult sometimes, especially if you're more on the design side. You know, I think planning firms, especially small to mid-sized planning firms, tend to be a little better about that. But you know, if it's three token folks, you know, I think you can make some assumptions to keep your sanity, to be honest. And that keeps me from even thinking about going to some places that I think I would love working. And I think to that point, negotiating spaces and rooms with like big vision dudes who have a reputation for being misogynist or being like horrible to their staff is something that like I've had to deal with. I've had to be in the room with those people, and like they talk like they're God, and like every single idea that they say is something that should, you know, just be, you know, written in gold ink on this planning document because it's such a great thing that we have this guy that came from the Northeast who's this big design vision on this Texas project. And it is very annoying, and there's not any good way to speak out about that kind of structural issue that keeps people like that in power. But at the same time, it's very validating and affirming when I get to talk and say shit that's way more impressive than that guy. So just, I'm constantly getting into positions where I get to be on equal footing with people, and I think that debases some of the power structures that are in place that historically we've not been able to question in practice, if that makes sense. I was going to say something else, but I forgot it.
That's okay. When you remember it, come back with it. But I think I want to go to that question, Danielle. That was something we talked about. Like, why does it matter? Why do our identities matter for planning, for design, for engineering, for art? Like all of this, why does it matter? So I think we can talk about that for a little bit. But I think before we go on, I'll just tell a small story. So I think a lot of folks here might know we just redid the 5th floor of the West Mall building. If you've been up there, it looks gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's all new, flashy, shiny. It's amazing. And folks are going to start using that space. And I went up there yesterday for a meeting, and I was like excited. I was like, oh my God, I want to look at this space. And you know, someone showed me the space, and I walked through it. And in the end, I was like, I have an issue. And she was like, what is it? Because it's such an impressive space. I was like, why do we still have 2 gendered restrooms? Like, here we are. I feel like we've been through this again and again. And I know that's something, you know, as students and faculty on campus, like I've been in part of this conversation for a long time. It is now in our facilities master plan that when a new building is made, we have to have at least 1 gender neutral restroom for I think every 5 floors. It's frustrating that then when we refurbish buildings, we kind of throw that rule out the window and just go with those 2 gendered restrooms. And it's such an amazing space, but I feel like, and it just made me question, like on the team that was working on this, did they have anybody who could speak from that experience or speak from the experience of loved ones with that experience to be like, have we considered this restroom situation, which I also at this point feel like is such a common conversation. But I think it's just an example of like, I think for me it was like one of those moments where I was like, this is why it matters. Like just having someone on that team to make sure that when we create spaces or when we plan things, they're actually serving everyone and are inclusive. But yeah.
No, that's a part of me is like, oh my god, I don't want to talk about bathrooms. Although I said this to the other panelists, I used the restroom right next door right before this meeting started, and I walked in and there was one of my campaign stickers on one of these chairs right in the bathroom, and like, that was kind of cool. I didn't put it there, let's be clear. Why does it matter? Well, I mean, the representation matters, and representing all of the voices in our, in our, not just our LGBTQIA community, but our larger community. So my son's little dude, medium-sized dude, he turns 18 in a couple weeks, but in a wheelchair. And, here's an example of like lived experience as a special needs parent now, is that, and I, way before Peter was born, I was a design professional pretty, up to designing for ADA compliance, right? Making sure that I'm designing streets and ramps and all of that is working. And it's one thing to like know the manual. And it's another thing to actually like experience what it's like in the world, navigating a space if you're mobility impaired. And, and I get to do even that with a little bit of privilege, right? Because I'm pushing the chair and not trying to do it myself. But, that's why it matters to have like the voice of kind of the LGBTQIA community, because it's like for somebody to say, hey, have we thought about the restrooms? Or having somebody that is in the disability community talk about, yeah, okay, that's compliant, but this is why that would be, frustrating. Or to have somebody, from another marginalized community remind me as somebody who's not, who's still white, that my context of, why I think a bike lane would be awesome there comes from a different lived experience than somebody who might be African American in the community. And I am better at being aware of my limitations by surrounding myself with a bigger, diverse group of people. And that's why I think that people, since, we're everywhere, right? The queer community, there's a lot of us, why those conversations need to be elevated.
Good.
No.
I think historically, having LGBTQ folks in planning, thinking about like neighborhoods was, we still talk about the neighborhood as like a type of neighborhood typology where like, there's this density of that community and that tight knit
Brunch
connection
everywhere.
and brunch everywhere. And yeah, that's all you need to do in your land use plan is brunch location. Like it's a new land use code only for neighborhoods called brunch.
And tiny homes. Tiny homes. Lots of tiny homes.
But I think it changes the dynamic a little bit because I think that as we have gained more rights, and as there has been less persecution overall, not saying it's not there anymore, and it certainly still is, especially in this state, there's less and less of a need for us to co-locate. And so I think we need to start thinking about it more as distributed resources for folks who identify as part of the LGBTQ community. And I think that looks very different than what it looks like to kind of look at the density of resources that community needs. And so like Houston has Montrose, right, which is the historic neighborhood there. We don't really have a historic neighborhood in Austin, but that's where all of the resources for health related to gay folks are in that community. That's where, I don't remember the name of all those, but they're all located in one space. And so I think especially related to very specific health and also building typology characteristics, we need to be thinking in a more distributed way about what that means for a community that is now much more distributed. But I also think city planning specifically is still incredibly important to think about for LGBTQ folks because especially in Texas, it is still the only place that we feel safe. And not always, because we've had folks who have gotten attacked in the last 6 months in this city, in the gay district, in downtown. And Yeah, I mean, I don't know how city planning solves that, except that the more inclusive we are of everyone, especially our most vulnerable, the more empathy we're going to be building into our communities.
I'm just gonna merge this with another question that we talked about, was like, why is it important for non-cis hetero, cis hetero folks, identifying folks, how should they engage? Well,
Do you want to say
non-LGBT.
what cis is?
Yeah, so I think folks know like trans, right? So the opposite of trans is essentially what we're going to cis. So I'm a cis-identifying person, right? So that's where I'm coming from. And essentially, I think non-LGBTQ identifying folks in planning and design and engineering, why should they engage with these questions? I'm just going to throw it in there and I think build partially on what you were talking about, right? Like, it's important for all of us to be engaged in this as we're working. Like, the planning is one of those things. It's interesting. There was this, I remember one of my classes, we did this great article, and I love it. It's called The Myth of Gay Affluence. And there's this notion I can talk about in housing, for example, in real estate and housing, that gay people are generally really rich. They're more able to buy housing. They don't have a lot of family needs. There's these sort of assumptions built into what we're thinking about those folks. And there was this great article on saying the myth of gay affluence. There is a myth that somehow gay folks are richer. If anything, the data shows they're actually not. Like, there's sparing data, but it shows actually it's not. It depends on who you're asking. Do white cis men who are cohabitating, their household income might be higher, but if you're going to talk about do black women who are cohabitating, their income is going to be completely different. So I think there's something to be had in terms of everyone engaging in these conversations as we're making these decisions, I think, in planning and in design. That's important.
I mean, it kind of goes back around what I said a few minutes ago, that it's being really intentional to bring all of the voices into a space, and that goes way beyond just what we're talking about for LGBTQIA. But if you start from this idea of understanding, I hate to use it, sort of other, right? If there is, we talk about heteronormative. If there was like, the majority, and you're outside of that, it's, what's important is really being intentional for all of these questions, that we go outside of our experience, so that because we can't help by being informed by that. And that's certainly true. Like, I think as a design professional, and especially more engineering than planning, but an engineer brain is look at it and go, okay, I've solved the problem, right? At least the planner is going to be usually more methodical about how we get to that solution. But
well, we hope.
Right.
We hope that there will be more methodical.
Yeah, I said usually, right? Not always, but I've come through my career, I've come to realize that I have one solution to the problem, and that solution is informed by everything else in my life. So I could, not to go too deep into the weeds, but if we're going to build a road and I need to buy some more land to make the road bigger or add a bicycle lane or something, I know there was plenty of time in my career when I would look at trying to make that decision and say, what's the least expensive way to do it? That's rational, right? It's like, well, the least, and yet that by its very nature in many places is inherently racist. And and we have a legacy of transportation planning from the last century that did that over and over again and destroyed communities. But it took me time to really realize that the questions that need to be answered, if you're going to make a decision matrix, okay, I can come up with a bunch of ideas, but the best matrix is asking a whole bunch of people of what's important. And when you get that collection together is when we really start to find, comprehensive solutions to these problems.
I would also say, I think every single community you work in is going to have someone and multiple people who are in the LGBTQ community. And so, it is in every single planning process, if you're doing a community plan in a black neighborhood and you do not engage with black leaders and black community in that neighborhood, and you also don't empower those leaders to carry forward the vision, and you just help facilitate, that's problematic. But we have never been proactive in engaging LGBTQ leaders or LGBTQ folks, because it's not like in every neighborhood there's like the one queer ambassador that we know who to engage with. But I think that, you know, historically, groups like Equality Texas or other smaller nonprofit groups that focus on LGBTQ issues in our cities, I don't think that they've ever really historically been asked to engage in community planning processes. And I think that that should become standard. Because for me to say that in a big planning process in any city I work in, it's kind of like a thing over there that, yeah, that'd be kind of cool if we do it, but there is no expectation that we would do that. There's no expectation in practice that we would try to pull in leaders who might know people who live in that community who can speak to that experience. And I think that we need to be more proactive as planners in order to do that. I think the last thing I'm going to say is just the thing I was thinking about earlier in terms of negotiating is I think also relevant to this. So I'm not, I can't think of one specific example where I've had to deal with something on its face that is just horribly racist or misogynistic or homophobic toward me. Most of what I'm negotiating in my interactions with people in planning is well-intentioned liberal people. And honestly, they're and you know, it's tough because intention only gets you so far. And one of the things I think we probably all have to deal with, and I'll speak for myself anyway, is that I constantly have to make a decision about how much work I'm going to do personally to help you get it as one of those well-intentioned people, rather than saying, you're a smart person, I mean, I can only help you this much, but I know that you can figure this out yourself. How much work gets put on you as an individual to expand your thinking, and how much is burdened with the folks who are part of that community or who are a part of some other kind of vulnerable community that we might be talking about? I think that's really an important question. And honestly, it's incredibly important in planning. And so I think when we talk about community engagement, you know, it's part of how we talk about community engagement is we're asking people to spend their time to tell us how to do this planning project that was probably initiated by the city, that was envisioned by the city, that, you know, now we're under contract for, and this is the first time the community is meeting us, and hey, give up your 2 hours for this community meeting when you have all this other stuff going on. Like, and tell us about you, and tell us about how that should inform practice, and that is a burden, you know, at a different scale than what I'm talking about, but that is something that you have to think about when we think about what engagement looks like. And honestly, we do less and less community workshops because we want to go to where people already are, and so we're going out to community events and saying, you know, here are 2 workshop activities if you have time, but we're going to Luling's Hispanic Chamber of Commerce festival that they put on, or we're going to a Friday night football game in rural, you know, Bastrop County, or, you know, we're doing things where we're trying to reduce the burden on people we're trying to actually help within the planning process.
And I think, you know, we're gonna miss enough time, but I think one of the things that I want to bring on that, I think, idea is essentially like this work cannot happen with like us or, you know, like even the folks in this room. It really has to be all of our professions, everyone taking up some of this work, and I think pushing it forward. And I think, you know, folks, if they were to say, well, you know, people are already doing that, well, if people were already doing that, we would not see the outcomes that we see for LGBTQ identifying folks in our cities, right? I know how many folks know, but in general, the statistic shows that if you include everybody, LGBTQ, all of us, 7 to 8% folks in a population identify as LGBTQIA. And among homeless populations, 40 to 45% folks identify as LGBTQIA. So think about what do those outcomes look like. And we see this across the board for race outcomes, whether you talk about health, whether you talk about housing and housing discrimination, whether we talk about, you know, transit and transportation access. if folks were actually engaging with LGBTQ populations in our fields, we would not see the outcomes that we see today, right? So I think it's something that we all have to engage in. And if you all don't want to add something, I want to make sure we have a bunch of questions and we can go back to them, but I want to make sure if folks have questions or things they want to add. And I will honestly say at this point, you can do questions or comments. We're open to having a conversation. Yeah, sure.
This is definitely something I have been interested in researching more on my own. But Danielle, you suggested, or you said that the notion of picking the least expensive option is inherently racist. Can you explain that a little?
So let me clarify, like in the context of like buying land for a project, right? Well, it starts from this place that says the least expensive property is, in that sense, is the best choice. Well, why is it less expensive? I mean, so maybe it's not fair to say that by itself is inherently racist, but it's like it is subject to the legacy of decades of sort of institutionalized racism that created communities. All the redlining in Austin that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and not just Austin, but in so many cities. It was really this idea of, well, we want to do what's easiest for the project, and yeah, that house is less expensive to buy. Not only just in terms of cost, but also access to power, right? For the community, like the people who own the property, their ability to negotiate the real estate transaction, quite honestly. What we see is that in an affluent community, they're going to basically hire an attorney, and their property owner's attorney is going to represent them, and if it goes to a condemnation proceeding or something like that. But all of that access to our legal system, again, all comes back down to this question of, of resources, honestly. So, and all of those kind of kept pointing to outcomes that, we achieved over and over again in every city in America, and now we're working really hard to try to unwind, what we did in terms of transportation planning in particular, but not just transportation planning. So I think that was my context.
And I want to add to that. I feel like, in like racial justice and equity work, we talk a lot about how we come to a lot of the decision making, particularly government, comes from a deficit mindset, right? There's always deficit, we're trying to fill it. But that does not necessarily always exist in that way, right? Like Danielle and I serve on the city's LGBTQ commission, or Danielle has just stepped off. That's like, not anymore. But we...
Elections have consequences, y'all.
But I think, like, one of the things that we talk about is, right, like we're taking on the city budget, we're making recommendations for our community and other communities. Nearly half of our budget goes into policing.
Yes.
And somehow that exists on this side. Nearly half, I'm not even joking, you can go look at the numbers from the budget office. Half of our budget goes towards policing and the Austin Police Department, even with a contract that was negotiated down. And when we start talking about needs, we're like, oh, well, we need to do more like HIV planning, and there's like the small pots of money trickling down department to sub-department to the health equity aspect of the health department. So I think it's like that deficit mindset from which we function. We never go and ask folks, like, what do you need? We tell them, here's these 2 things that we think can work, what do you think, right? That's the most we would go, if we ever go at all. Otherwise, we're like, this one's the most cost efficient, makes sense, let's just do this. So I think it's that we need to move away from that conversation, which is not the same conversation that we have when we talk about other spheres. And I think that's why I bring up the, our city budget, that we're not having that conversation in other aspects, but somehow we have that conversation when we're talking about serving certain populations, or frankly serving underserved folks in our cities in general.
Can I just say really quick, the burden comment I made, just that was not intended to apply any feeling to you guys asking questions. So Seriously, like, we have made a conscious decision to be here and to be resources and to literally answer whatever question y'all have for us. We want to be resources. That's the role we're playing right now. I'm just saying to your friends, before you expect or have an expectation that they owe you their story, just say, are you willing to talk to me about this? Or is it okay if I use you as a sounding board? Or is it okay if I ask your advice about how to approach that? Because I think leading all conversations more from the perspective of like all of these conversations and have an impact on our individual mental health. You know, like before I talk to you about my problems, like, and all this crap that's happening in my life that I'm really upset about, are you okay? Like, can you take this on right now? Just generally is I think how we should be approaching conversations like that. But that was not to say anything about today. We want to be resources.
We have other questions. Wanna?
Yeah, thank you for your comments that come from a different field, but it's similar, policy stuff. I was just curious the extent to which the professional associations that you must join or that license people, what role does this conversation have in those systems of work?
Gosh, that's a good question. If anybody wants to talk, I can
Go ahead.
jump in. I think, so it's interesting, I've been involved with, like, you know, I can speak as a planner. We have two major associations, the American Planning Association and the American Collegiate Schools of Planning. So these sort of two bodies, and I think it's interesting, one of the conversations I've had is, so we have like these LGBTQ interest groups sometimes exist, and it's funny, the interest groups is made up of all people who happen to be LGBTQ identifying, who are just like sitting there fighting for the same thing, and you talk to people and you're like, oh, yeah, we talked about this 20 years ago. And you're like, that sounds really reassuring. We're gonna talk about this for the next 20 years. So I think our conversations happening, yes, they are. And I think, you know, we can be, you know, to look at the positive side, there has been an inclusion of some of these groups and conversations. I still think in larger associations, and I would say this is across almost all fields, these groups are still very much marginalized. And if anything, it sometimes starts feeling like death by committee, where it's like, y'all go talk in this corner here and bring us your report, and then we'll consider that report. And 20 years later, you're sitting having the same conversation. Mm-hmm. And I say that as a person who serves on like way too many committees. Like, this is gonna laugh at me because it's true. Like, you make a committee and I'll serve on it. My boyfriend's laughing in the back. Essentially, is the funniest part. But I think to that point, right? Like, how do we move that work out of committees? How is it that conversation is not happening in the main body, but is happening in what we call interest groups? And I think that's frustrating to me. This is, of course, a personal opinion, I would say. I was going to add something.
I think it's even more stark in science fields. So I balance my time going to APA or ASLA and ESA, which is Ecological Society of America, and so that national conference is really interesting. There's a very small subset of sessions at that conference that I actually care about, because I don't need to know about the spawning habitats of that cockroach. But I just don't. But at the same time, you know, I think it's even more stark in science because there's this historic value of objective science, and that you can separate things into parts and into systems on their own, and you can just study the ecology of a place and you can ignore everything else, and that's totally valid science still. And so I think that, you know, I literally, my tagline for the way I market the business I do is, I'm increasing the scientific rigor of planning and design work, but I also say through an equity lens. Because those two things are not in the same sentence very often, and the structures aren't set up to do that because of how we valued, air quotes, objectivity. And I think planning is, I think the role as planners is to be advocates and to be translators and to loop back around to where we started, you know, to really question the entire structure of the systems with which we are working in.
And I just want to honestly thank you for that question. I think that's such a, like, because this makes a perfect point for me to ask folks, push those conversations in whatever spaces you are in and support other folks in having those conversations. And this does not just happen to be a conversation about LGBTQI identifying folks. It's really across the board, right? Like, we've seen race interest groups and women interest groups, and they all seem to happen in the same way. And there is something to be said about how do we make those conversations mainstream in our sort of bodies where we get together and talk about our professions. It's something to be said about that.
And it's really exciting when it happens. I mean, I think of WTS, the Women's Transportation Seminar, and they were very proactive about engaging me. And I remember, like, last year I got an award from them, and I had this pause where I was like, oh my gosh, there was an organization that had never really thought about trans identities that has sort of stepped right in and said, okay, yeah, help us learn more, help us be part in that. And, not only being affirming to me, which was wonderful, but also like doing that opportunity to take an organization that, has been working on these questions of gender equality for a long time in the profession, and recognizing that, that conversation is broader than they thought it was before. So, there's good work that's happening.
I think the other side of that coin too is that I think when people are immediately like, yes, come in, we want you here, we want to be a part of empowering you, there's like a honeymoon phase. And then when you start questioning everything they're doing, you're like, oh no, that's too much work. That's too much work. We didn't need you here for that. We just need you here for the photo. It's true. That is an experience that is not unique to LGBTQ folks, but I think that's unique to a lot of folks who are a minority or identify somewhat differently than what the status quo is in our organizations or in our practice.
Another question.
What's the third one up there?
I would like to briefly comment on the idea of interest groups. As a professional and as a person who's done research, I find them irritating and unproductive. And I just wanted to point out that there are different approaches to why someone might decline an interest group, or why they might defer with, let's say, just wait a couple minutes or a couple years or a couple decades or whatever it is to participate. their own communities, and then we're forced to integrate as well. So it's not like it was I find it frustrating to participate in that interest group today, because it doesn't really acknowledge that integration is difficult, and it's oftentimes not a choice for people of color, who are oftentimes the enemy of other interest groups. And it really poses a sort of, are you on the defensive or are you on the offensive side of this issue? And sometimes that's not the place where I want to go. That's not the place where I want to be. That's not the place where I want to sort of speak and represent myself from. And sometimes I can't say what it's like for somebody else, because that's not who I am.
And I think you honestly.
So I just want to put that out there, that I decline often.
Yeah, and I think it raises like
I just want
think.
to point out that there's different perspectives on why that might come about.
Oh yes, and I think that partially goes back to I think what Katie was saying in terms of I think that conversation on burdening folks, right? Like we have really put the onus on folks who might be facing discrimination or who might feel like they're not being heard on somehow fighting within those structures to be heard. And I think there is some of that fatigue that comes from like just being on every committee. But essentially, you know, it's part of that work, and you're right, that somehow, one, we cannot represent the voices of everybody within the community. We're not here as representatives of folks. There's so many lived experiences that we do not know, right? We do not have that experience. We talk about it. The other is, it's not just on the LGBTQIA community or other communities to fight for themselves constantly within larger, powerful structures and institutions. We had another question?
Oh yeah, first of all, I appreciate all of you for being out professionally. It's very helpful. Given that, has there been any situations where you presented a design or people have used your identity to kind of undercut that project or undermine your work? I know you mentioned, Danielle, that people are like, well, you're an engineer and your gender doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But do you think that's true? Do you think people are actually holding that when they're assessing your work? Or is there a moment where you, Katie, when you're talking about the good old boys who don't accept your identity, have there been moments that's impacted your career, and how do you navigate that?
I have a couple
Yeah,
examples.
please go right ahead.
You know, so I transitioned professionally in place 3 years ago. Was when I came out at work. You know, sent a letter to 400 of my clients and colleagues across the state. It was a thing, and you know, and also in the letter gave people permission to share it because I knew they were going to anyway. So I wanted to. I'm like, look, share the letter. At least that way you've got my words. And I was received pretty positively most of the time, more than I was prepared, quite honestly, since I work all over the state. But how does it affect? It happens in ways that are subtle and really hard to pinpoint, and in that sense it's more insidious. It's no longer getting called to be on a team for a project. It's some self-policing that happened even in my own firm, quite honestly. I, you know, was never invited to take part in our interviews in Williamson County anymore, for example. And, you know, there was a part of me that was like, well, that's cool, I don't want to go to Williamson County anyway. But the other side is I realized that, like, some of that was everybody with the best intentions trying to navigate this space. You know, that was because potential clients had expressed their, you know, disapproval of who I am, right? You know, there's a lot of folks, many of them are at the Capitol still, who feel like they get a vote on my identity, you know? And so that's what's sad is that, but none of that would come to my face. You know, it came when I just looked at the fact of the opportunities that existed before more than a few stopped existing. I'm sort of always an optimist because there's sort of new opportunities opened up too in ways that were, you know, equally or more fulfilling. But I think that's the real challenge is if somebody's going to hold a bias, it usually ends up taking the form of, you know, missed opportunity as opposed to somebody doing something overtly, you know, problematic.
I cannot think of a scenario that where I was undermined because of how out I am, or that any of the work that I've done was undermined because of it. If anything, you know, the one scenario I can think of, one in the 4 years since I've been practicing, is I think that I've had one scenario with one person, another woman, who I think felt very threatened by me, and then actively tried to undermine me, actually. And I think that is shocking for me to experience, because I am such a believer in, like, we need to be helping each other out. Like, we need to be allies in every way possible. That's why that example I gave earlier about how, like, this dude is getting angry every time this strong black woman engineer from Houston, like, is voicing her opinion. Like, I need to figure that out. That literally happened, like, 2 days ago. But yeah, that's the one time I've been undermined, is I think when I have threatened the power of a project manager who was a woman.
I guess I'm more concerned about if the big concern is like if you present an assignment and people write it off as, oh, that's the queer version of this. Like, I mean, that'd be my big fear, is like if you're like, oh, well, this is my take on what should happen, and someone's like, well, we're not going to go with that because that's the queer lens of what should be done in society. We're going to go with something more orthodox, and I just want to experience anything like that.
I mean, I think some of that sort of questioning does happen. I agree with, I think, Danielle, it's much more subtle now. And I just want to be cognizant of time because we're supposed to end, but I think to your point, don't worry about it. I think we'll continue this conversation. I think I'm at least here and I would love to continue that conversation. But I think, yes, there's subtle ways in which that does happen, where I think people, not just as an, oh, this is the LGBTQ point of view, but it's often sort of like the non-mainstream point of view. And it sometimes gets dismissed. So I think I hear what you're saying. Well, I think I'm just going to say thank you all for being here. And we're going to enter this space soon. So one thing I'm going to say before we go is, one, I want to thank both my panelists, Katie and Danielle. Thank you so much for being here. And I think the only other thing I want to say is, if you're all at UT, the Gender and Sexuality Center has an amazing ally toolkit for LGBTQIA folks. That's like, and there's 2 parts to it, so I would say definitely look into that and learn. And if you want to ask questions about that, let me know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, I'll be here for a little bit if you have any questions, or out in the lobby, wherever we need to go.
Happy to be a resource personally for anyone who wants to talk more about any of this.
Thank you all.